Welcome back to the Complete History of Coffee. Today we are doing an interview on the history of unionization at Starbucks and what led to the current Red Cup Rebellion. Grab your favorite caffeinated beverage and let's get started. So today we are here with Shabazz, one of my coworkers from Starbucks. Shabazz is very knowledgeable about the union action that's been going on at Starbucks, but I want you to introduce yourself. Talk a little bit about your backstory with Starbucks and the union.
My name is Shabazz. I'm a strike captain at the SAG-AFTRA Starbucks on Wilshire and Curzon in Los Angeles, California. I've worked at Starbucks since about August of 2023. I had moved to Los Angeles, like many film students before me, with the hopes of starting my career and picking up some gigs as a PA, and I thought I was off to a good start. And then, of course, there was a massive industry shutdown when the Writers Guild and the Actors Guild went on strike. So I got a job at Starbucks, and I have been working there pretty much ever since.
We have a very similar backstory on that one then.
I should have
for acting.
I should have quit in November of 2023. By this point, the strikes had ended, if I remember correctly, and the manager that I was working under at the time was just a very toxic person. It got to a point where I went home to my girlfriend one day, and I was just like, I miss being unemployed because at least I didn't have to deal with this. So then she had the brilliant idea of, hey, you should try to get fired so that you can at least get unemployment benefits.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, there's a union movement happening right now. If I'm already at a point where I have nothing left to lose, and the thing that was holding me back from getting involved with Starbucks Workers United was I thought that this job was going to be temporary.
I think that's a good point, because I think a lot of people that do work at Starbucks, or other businesses that maybe haven't unionized yet, I think they're often afraid to take that leap because you don't want to potentially put your job on the line. So that is a good place.
Yeah, because I've been following Starbucks Workers United campaign since at least January of 2022. And it's around that time that Starbucks Workers United really started to take off and become the latest entry in a very long history of Starbucks workers unions.
So I do want to talk about the history of Starbucks unions. Real quick, though, we are doing our coffee tasting today. We're doing a Kona coffee from Hawaii. This is Lion's brand. So for those of you keeping up on the podcast, we did previously talk about that one. Definitely a very smelly coffee. It has kind of a sweet roastiness to it. This was a French press. So you definitely kind of get a little bit of the oils in it. It's actually a very smooth coffee, though. What are you getting? I don't know how many coffee tastings you do.
Can I describe the differences between specific roasts? Not to nearly the same technical extent as some of my coworkers. But am I good at making drinks in the way that someone specifically wants them? Absolutely.
So let's go ahead then and jump into a history of the Starbucks Union, because I think for a lot of people, they assume that it started about 4 years ago, I want to say, out of Buffalo, New York. But obviously, as you've mentioned to me before, there's a much larger history.
Yeah, so Starbucks Workers United did start around 2021. And, there were a lot of conditions that led to that movement really taking off when it did. You had the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. This, of course, increased the workload that a lot of Starbucks baristas had to deal with, because you had that period of time where in-store foot traffic was basically just down to single digits, essentially. We were still in that part of the
social distancing.
Yeah, we were still in that stage of pandemic response where we were really trying to emphasize social distancing, and we were emphasizing masking and trying to limit social contact with other people. As the pandemic wore on, and you had, of course, and people got sick of the restrictions, but for the most part, corporations were getting really sick of the restrictions and were campaigning the government to start rolling back some of those COVID era protections. More and more customers started going back into Starbucks stores and making those in-store purchases, in-store visits. And you had the workload of mobile orders and contending with the invisible queue of mobile orders, as well as the actual physical line that you have in your cafes. All of those things are just kind of coalescing together. And then you have also, of course, the general problems that working at Starbucks has always had. The wages have not kept up with inflation. The workload has gotten significantly harder, but the pay and the benefits has not kept up with the amount of work that is being placed on baristas.
And then I think we could say that for, of course, a lot of jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some people are asking, like, well, why Starbucks? Why not go work somewhere else? And of course, there's always the point of like, okay, well, it's harder on McDonald's employees. It's harder on teachers. It's harder on everyone. I mean, it's not specific to just Starbucks employees, just baristas. Really, a lot of the working class is getting hit with that.
Yeah, like I think if you have a job, you have probably experienced within the last few years, especially just like that crunch of your workforce is getting reduced because upper management wants to like cut down on those labor costs, but also your workload is increasing because they also want you to be more productive. And with inflation really accelerating in the last few years, the wages that you have gotten have not kept pace with that inflation for the most part.
I wanted to actually go a little bit further back before we get to the modern union, because I think a lot of people want to look at Starbucks. And I mean, I did objectively at first. Starting out, I'm like, man, what a great company to work for. I mean, it's got competitive pay. You get benefits of 20 hours a week, college and free coffee markout and food, drinks. But you explained to me that some of these things weren't inherently part of Starbucks to begin with, that some of these came from earlier union actions. So going into the backstory on the history of the unions with Starbucks.
So if you've worked at Starbucks, then you've probably heard some version of the line that Starbucks is like an industry leader in terms of offering part-time benefits to employees. The company culture has always tried to present itself as one that's inherently benevolent. That's why they insist we're called partners instead of, employees or workers. I'd heard about this a while ago, but apparently like when Starbucks would have its meetings with the board of investors, there would always be like an empty chair representing the partners.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So like this is the kind of like corny presentation that Howard Schultz has always insisted upon having.
But it's for show is what you're getting at.
Yeah, like Howard Schultz and Starbucks, they've always presented themselves in like this really benevolent light. So in his 1997 memoir, Pour Your Heart Into It, Howard Schultz describes his relationship with his workers like this. I was convinced that under my leadership, employees would come to realize that I would listen to their concerns. If they had faith in me and my motives, they wouldn't need a union. And he's specifically talking about the history of this period of time in the 1980s when Starbucks workers at their warehouses and the roastery were unionized under UFCW Local 1001.
Before he took over the company, though.
Yeah, they had first started organizing, I believe, in around like 1985, and then they had secured their first contract in 1986. So Howard Schultz takes over Starbucks, I believe, somewhere around 1987. I think there might have been a little overlap in 1986. But this first contract was secured right before he had taken over. And Howard Schultz promised that he would honor this contract. This is not how history ends up playing out. To this day, Starbucks claims to be the industry leader in offering benefits to its part-time employees. And they still frame Howard Schultz as the guy who kind of brought that idea to the US as just like, this is the guy who thought to himself, hey, we should give our part-time employees some health insurance or some paid time off and other benefits like that.
Like how he presents himself as being the bringer of espresso culture to the United States, as if there weren't already people doing it like Pete and some of these other big companies.
Yeah, like Howard Schultz has a very storied history of exaggerating his innovations and his business decisions. I had this brilliant idea of being nice to my employees.
I mean, I guess when you're the one writing the book.
Yeah, because like, yes, Starbucks does offer benefits to its part-time employees that probably are a little bit competitive. I'm not going to say that they're industry leading. I am of the belief that as a large employer, you should be offering benefits to your part-time employees. If we're not going to have like a social safety net that's provided by the government, like at a bare minimum, your employer should at least take a little bit of that responsibility that's being shirked by every other part of the country.
So what did Schultz do with these unions?
Let me ask you this. How many hours in a week do you have to work in order to get benefits as a part-time employee of Starbucks?
Just 20.
And per like that period of time, like how many hours is that total?
What you mean during like a
Yeah,
6
like
month
during
period?
like during that audit period.
Oh, it's like 520 something.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact number, but averaging 20 a week will get you there.
So, per an article for Political Magazine by Eric Scigliano, the standard contract for grocery workers in the Puget Sound area provides individual medical benefits with about 15 hours a week and family benefits with about 19.
Wow.
Both better than the 20 hours a week that Starbucks requires for eligibility. And these are the contracts that were being won by unions like UFCW for, again, grocery workers in the Seattle area and like people who work in like local drugstores, local department stores, that kind of thing. This was the standard in 1986.
Wow.
Howard Schultz doesn't become CEO of Starbucks until 1987. He is, by every historical measure,
Late to the game.
Yes. And as a matter of fact, he is actually worse than a lot of employers were in 1986.
His innovation was to make it harder to achieve your benefits.
His innovation was to make it harder to achieve your benefits and to not have a union to fight on your behalf.
And that's assuming, right, that you're getting the 20 hours a week, because not everyone's getting it. When I started at Starbucks, I think I was averaging about 15. So based on what you were talking about, I could have gotten some benefits on that old union contract, but even with modern day Starbucks standards, I wouldn't have gotten any benefits.
No. Like, if anything, I think that should be one of the things that kind of shows just how far things have degraded. It was the standard for part-time workers to be getting health insurance and like other benefits for 15 to 19 hours of work per week. And we're now at a point where you have to work 20 hours a week in order to get health insurance that takes a significant chunk out of your paycheck.
It's not free.
Yeah.
For those of you that think Starbucks gives you health insurance, it does not give you health insurance. It's just a reduced health insurance plan.
Yeah, like my base salary is $20.26 an hour. And after you take out taxes, health insurance.
In California, it's pretty high.
Yeah, taxes, health insurance, vision insurance, and all of that. I'm making about like $13 an hour as my take home
Which
pay.
is about what I was making in New Mexico after being at Starbucks for 6 years.
Is that your base pay or was that like
the New Mexico minimum wage, don't quote me, I want to say it's about $10.50 an hour now. When I started, it was $8 an hour. So even though I was getting pay raises every year, it was essentially just kind of keeping up with the state minimum wage increase. So even after 6 years, I was only at like $13.50 an hour.
Yeah. And like Starbucks has this pattern of always like framing their benefits in this way where they're, you know, really, really generous, really, really progressive. And they will also turn around and say that with the pay and the benefits that you are getting from Starbucks, when you total the value of that all together, you are making the equivalent of $30 an hour.
And that's what they can put on Indeed when they're offering up barista positions. You'll be making essentially $30 an hour.
I mean, that's also like the press releases that Starbucks has, put out since our contract negotiation stalled last year. That $30 an hour number is like always just coming up of just like, this is the total value of what we are offering to our employees.
Well, and then of course the question might be, well, why not go get a job somewhere else? And, you know, as we've talked about, you came here for film, I came here for acting. Essentially still film.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, we have to think about Starbucks is a good job to be at, as you were talking about, because it does help pay the bills. And it's just something as a placeholder for now till you can really get into the career that you're trying to do. We both have a degree, right? We're not just showing up to Starbucks and we had no plan for life or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that it's always that easy, right? So I would say Starbucks feels, on paper, like it's a better job than a lot of other jobs, like working at McDonald's or something, even though they're making the same amount an hour. Let's be honest here. They're getting that same fast food minimum wage. But obviously there are those benefits. So why do we have the benefits? Because that came from earlier union action.
Yeah. So before Howard Schultz takes over, in 1986, UFCW Local 1001 secures a contract with Starbucks where part-time employees are given that paid time off. They're given health benefits. They're given a lot of the benefits that we get to enjoy today are won by UFCW Local 1001. in 1986. When Howard Schultz takes over, he promises that he's going to honor this contract and try to keep those benefits in place. And one of the first things he does is immediately he tries to raise the threshold for how many hours you would have to work in order to qualify for those part-time benefits.
So is that where that 20 came from?
That is where that 20 hours a week eventually comes from.
Okay.
He also engages in the strategy where initially the Starbucks workers that were represented by the union were the people who worked in the warehouses and at the roastery. There were a number of cafes in the Seattle area, were not represented by UFCW Local 1001. But what Howard Schultz insisted on was to include those cafes in the bargaining unit. And the idea for him was by having these cafes suddenly become members of the bargaining unit and therefore like increasing the number of people that the union has to get, essentially consent from in order to actually function as a union and actually like hold that standing of being the collective bargaining representative for Starbucks employees.
So essentially hoping that it waters it down. So
Yeah.
they vote no to unionize it.
Yeah, Howard Schultz had hoped that the cafes would vote against unionizing and that the union would be killed by that. This plan backfires on him, and the majority of cafes end up voting to join the union.
Oh, good.
What begins after that is just a very, very lengthy contract negotiations process. And that's where Howard Schultz is introducing those ideas like raising the cap on what's the minimum hours that you have to work in a week in order to get those part-time benefits. Just cause termination. Let's throw that out. Because like as it stands right now, as a Starbucks employee, you are an at-will employee. Your employer can hire you and fire you for any reason whatsoever. They don't even have to like cite a reason. The minute that they decide that you're going to get fired, then you're fired. There was a period of time where the basic consensus among all employers was just like, well, you obviously have to have a good reason in order to fire somebody. Yeah. There's got to be a process behind it beyond just like the process of filing the paperwork to terminate somebody's employment, and it's just like a signature or something.
But if the manager doesn't like you, it could be literally that simple.
Yeah. These were the provisions that Howard Schultz was trying to take away from that union contract. And this was one of the ways that those contract negotiations were being delayed, because you have a bunch of these rights that the union has already secured in their first contract. And
so the first contract was already finalized.
Yeah, the first contract was ratified. It was finalized. This was basically set in stone. And Howard Schultz comes in and he's insisting on making these major changes that are ultimately going to be to the detriment of the workers represented by the union. No self-respecting union is going to settle for a contract that's going to be worse than the contract that came before it. Yeah. Protracted contract negotiations is a very modern union busting strategy that is still implemented to this day. And part of the reason that these protracted negotiations are such a beloved tactic among anti-union employers is because per federal labor law, if a union is unable to secure a contract with its employer after a 12-month period, the employees have the right to file a decertification petition and essentially like throw out the union and find a different form of representation with their employer to collectively bargain on their behalf, even if that representation ends up being no representation. That's exactly what happens in 1987. After Howard Schultz forces the union to expand its bargaining unit out to the cafes, after Howard Schultz fails to kill the union with that expansion effort, Howard Schultz and Starbucks management then protract the contract negotiations of just like, get rid of these benefits and then we'll sign on to this contract. And it gets protracted long enough where a decertification petition is eventually filed. Now, in Howard Schultz's biography, the decertification petition is attributed to this barista named Daryl Moore. Daryl Moore, in the way that Howard Schultz describes him, is this college student who's working part-time at Starbucks, and he voted against unionizing back in the 80s. And Daryl Moore comes around and he rallies his fellow coworkers to sign on to this decertification petition to get rid of the union and just let Howard Schultz be the person who will listen to the employees' concerns and listen to what the employees want and be the representative for both employer and employee.
And that was just in the cafes?
This was the part of the union that ends up lasting a little bit longer. I believe it was either the warehouse workers or the roastery. I think it was the roastery. The roastery plant has their workers are unionized up until around 1992. So much like Howard Schultz being, the inventor of benefits for part-time employees in the U.S., the claim that Daryl Moore was the singular person who started the decertification petition for the union is also highly exaggerated. In an article for Politico by Eric Scigliano, David Schmitz, the organizing director of USCW Local 1001 at the time, says, and I quote, "In my 30 years on staff at the union, it was the only management petition we ever saw to decertify a union. Howard was not aloof from this process. He did everything he could to provoke that situation." So from what people who were actually involved with the behind-the-scenes legal process of like contract negotiations and like decertification petitions and all of that, they have always maintained that from the minute the decertification petition was filed to the day that the union was actually decertified, Starbucks management was always present and actively working to decertify the union every step of the way. This story of a worker organically deciding that that his workplace didn't need union representation,
and corporate took a step back and
said,
"Oh, okay, if you want."
This story is mythical. We'll say.
So we can go ahead and look at what's happening in our more modern time with the union. But is there anything we need to like touch on between the 80s, 90s, and up till the 2020s?
Between the decertification of USCW in the 1980s and 2021, when the first stores in Buffalo, New York, vote to unionize and essentially start Starbucks Workers United and the current union movement, there are a number of initiatives by Starbucks employees to try to unionize their workplaces.
I was at a store that they were talking about it. We never even voted or anything, but I know someone reached out to a union. There was discussion.
Yeah, one of the more significant campaigns was in the like late 2000s, mid to late 2010s, and it was the IWW was working to unionize different Starbucks baristas. The IWW strategy was less about getting those legal wins and more about just like building that worker power. The IWW was the biggest union in the United States for the first part of the 20th century. Being a member of the IWW was something where you basically had a target on your back from the federal government, and the IWW literally got into military conflict with employers and the first, I think the first Air Force strike that was ever like the first time that the US used like aerial warfare was when the IWW was fighting for coal miners in Mattawan, and they had to go in the mountains with guns and literally like fight off a bunch of strikebreakers. And the federal government sent in planes to bomb them, if I remember correctly. Yeah,
wow.
I might be misremembering some of the details of that. I might be misremembering some of the exact details because it's been a minute since I've was learning about that story. But that was the level at which the IWW was at. Another part of the reason that the IWW lost a significant chunk of its power in the modern day is because in the during the first Red Scare, you had these they were called the Palmer Raids, and this was basically just an effort by the federal government to crack down on the IWW and a bunch of other labor organizations, just because it was the first Red Scare. They really didn't want to have a Soviet Union situation happening in the US. Yeah. Wow. So the IWW, it's still around today. It's not nearly as powerful as it was because they had to make this decades long effort to just strangle them essentially. But they're still doing a lot. They're still doing a lot of just really intense ground level infrastructural organizing about just, you know, getting workers the resources that they need. When you get to 2021, the IWW is still helping out Starbucks workers and helping them to unionize. Even to this day, we have like people in the IWW who are helping us to organize larger actions, who are helping us to like get strike kitchens set up, organizing to get us connected with other like related organizations. The IWW is really, really good at like building those coalitions. And that was one of the things that was like the goal that they were trying to do with their unionization efforts back in the 2000s and the 2010s. The history of unions in the US, or actually really history, is just a bunch of different dominoes that people set up over the course of many, many years. You're never going to know necessarily which domino is going to be where, and you don't necessarily know how the dominoes are going to fall and which domino is going to cause what to fall. You can look at that one particular period of time where it's the IWW at the forefront of organizing Starbucks unions, and you can judge that period as a failure because Starbucks workers don't end up unionizing on a large scale.
But at the time,
I think there's a lot of groundwork that does end up getting laid. Like, I've been on Zoom calls with some organizers with the current Starbucks Workers United movement, and one of the ways that they got into the union with the current unionization effort is because they had heard about the IWW effort when they were like significantly younger.
I see what you're saying, though. Set the groundwork for the current union. What are the key points on the contract? Specifically, what is it that the union is really fighting for? I know there's a lot of points. What are some of the key points? And then what are, I believe it's 3 sticking points, right? That the union can't seem to get Starbucks to agree to.
Better health benefits that aren't taking so much out of your paycheck. Yeah. Better pay so that you can actually afford to live wherever you are. And guaranteed hours, because in order to qualify for pay and for benefits, you also need to like be guaranteed that you're going to get the
20-hour minimum or whatever it would be.
Or at the very least, like you're getting the hours that you're promised, which is one of the things. Like recently in New York, there was a labor law settlement where Starbucks was found to have violated the Fair Workweek Act in New York. 39 million. It was like a 38.
It was a big settlement.
Yeah, it was like 35 to $38 million that was going to be dispersed to affected Starbucks employees. What that lawsuit was, I think, ultimately about was Starbucks was repeatedly violating the Fair Workweek Act by having the schedules for their workers just like change on a dime when you're supposed to give like that advance notice, and you're supposed to like give, you're supposed to provide some minimum guarantee for like schedule you for this long and we're going to pay you for the amount of time that you're working.
It sounds like not every state might have those protections for employees like New York does.
No, and that is that's part of the reason that a union contract is so important. A union contract makes it so that you're going to have broad labor protections across the board, no matter if you're in Georgia or if you're in New York or if you're in Louisiana. You're supposed to be guaranteed the same pay and that same benefits if you are represented by a union. And when you're not represented by a union, the protections you have at that point are going to be dependent primarily on like which state that you live in.
Federal, state labor laws.
You can look at the store closures that happened back in September. You had a number of people who, found out on Thursday that they were going to be losing their jobs, and then they were out of a job on Saturday.
Yeah.
In Washington.
Really no notice.
Yeah, with no notice. But you had certain...
But you are expected to put in 2 weeks, of course. Yeah. You're going to be leaving.
I believe in Washington State, the stores that found out that they were going to be closing, Washington State labor law requires that the employer provide notice of at least 2 months before announcing something like that. So I believe with the stores that are supposed to be closing in the Washington State area, they're supposed to close, I believe, 2 months after that September.
So that September, right?
Yeah,
or maybe it's just hitting now.
Yeah, I think they would have started closing down like maybe in the final week of November. Maybe they're starting to close now in December. I believe in New York, Starbucks has to pay them out for like the weeks that they were scheduled for as part of the Fair Workweek Act.
Okay, separate of whatever compensation that the company wants to give you.
So with the union stores, Starbucks had to actually go into negotiations with the union. The union asked for a timeline for when workers could expect to find out if they were going to be laid off or if they were going to be offered a transfer. They were able to bargain for a priority rehire of just like, if you were laid off, but you wanted to reapply at another store, as a completely new partner, then your application would be ahead of everybody else's applications because of the fact that you were part of a union store. You were also going to be guaranteed both the severance payout and the transfer,
more, right?
Yeah,
severance, because I think it was what was it, like 4 weeks plus a week for every year worked. But I think the union was able to get like an extra week or two.
I don't remember what the severance package that was negotiated was. What I do know is that with non-union workers, at least in California, but maybe it was like just across the board, non-union workers either had to choose between taking severance or taking a transfer. And with union employees who were laid off, they could take both the severance payout and the transfer. It wasn't a choice of one or the other. As a union employee who was working at a unionized store that had closed down, you were entitled to both the severance payout and the transfer offer if one was given to you.
Yeah. Why should people care? Why should people boycott Starbucks, not cross the picket line? Why does it matter to someone who doesn't work at Starbucks?
So the thing about our contract is that before negotiations stalled out in the winter of last year, our contract was 90% completed. The remaining 10% is that economic package where we are deciding on what those wages are going to be, what those health insurance benefits are going to be. And that economic package, it would cost the company $75 million to resolve just the bare minimum of what we're asking for. $75 million is what the company makes on an average day of sales. So they do have the money where they could very easily afford it. And it would probably cost them less money to just give us that bare minimum than to continue protracting the fight like this. The fact that the company is choosing to take this much costlier decision to just not offer an adequate economic package beyond a 1% raise or like a 2% raise, even like a 2.5% raise. The fact that they're continuing to stay within that range, and the fact that they are still actively trying to union bust stores as aggressively as they have been for the last 4 years, and the fact that they are continuing to insist that the union doesn't actually understand what we're asking for and that we're being unreasonable with our demands, that we are not properly acknowledging the fact that Starbucks is an industry leader in offering these part-time benefits. That's the thing that upsets them. It's the fact that they're being asked to change their structure and their policies by a barista. And this pisses them off to no end.
Yeah.
I think that's also why they're fighting so desperately, not only to not give us that union contract, not only to not have their workplaces unionize more and more, but also the higher level leadership, like Brian Nickel, has just been not publicly commenting about the union at all. The last time I heard him make a public comment about the union was after he had gotten hired, and he was like being directly asked about the union, being directly asked about how he was going to, negotiate with the union. Given that when he was CEO of Chipotle, the NLRB started investigating him for unfair labor practices after he shut down a number of Chipotle stores that had that were like either voting to unionize or had, expressed an interest in unionizing.
Wow.
So Brian Nickel already.
Perhaps if he was the CEO at the time, he would have just nipped that one in the butt back in New York and not let it spread.
Yeah, exactly. Howard Schultz was grilled by Bernie Sanders in a congressional hearing about Starbucks' union busting activities. The reputation of the brand has already taken a significant hit. So after they sue the union for copyright infringement, in the same week that the union posted solidarity for Palestine, there's this organic boycott that springs up. And, you know, you have people who are boycotting because of the fact that the union supports Palestine and Starbucks has a problem with the union. Like, there's a bunch of different reasons why people stop going to Starbucks.
The different dominoes.
And, like, whatever the reasons were, it affects the sales enough where the CEO of Starbucks, Laxman Narasimhan, makes the decision to begin working with the union towards a fair collective bargaining process and actually like negotiating that first union contract.
So was that part of the reason he got let go?
I mean, I think it's a very big part of the reason why he got let go. I think
it seems so random.
Oh,
all of a sudden it was just like, yeah, he's out. We're bringing in someone else.
One of the things that he really makes an effort to kind of like promote as far as his image as a CEO is like he's doing this thing of just like, yeah, he's picked up shifts as a barista. He's worked on the floor as a barista. There's a lot of art. There's a number of articles and photo shoots where you see him in a green apron, like serving people coffee with a bunch of Starbucks baristas. He's not pro-union by any means.
He's looking at the numbers. You know, he's looking at how can we come to an agreement that's going to benefit the company.
At the very least, he dares to treat the union as an entity that needs to be dealt with. Given the vibes I have gotten from Elliott Capital Management, this is unacceptable. And it's around this time where a lot of press is coming out about how Laxman is the reason that Starbucks is just like really crumbling and falling off. And also around this time is when Brian Niccol is brought up as the new CEO that the shareholders want to bring in. Like Brian Niccol is brought in by Elliott as like the CEO who's going to turn the company around, as the CEO who's going to like, you know, finally bring Starbucks back to its glory days.
Yeah. So going back, why people more broadly should care. Not that we weren't hitting on it, but I think I want to hone in a little bit. Of course, there's the argument, go work somewhere else. You know, we've already kind of touched on that. Like, it's a decent job to work for in regards to working with your schedule, pay, even if it's competitive or not. But more specifically, why should people care? You know, what's the importance of a union? Because we could argue that, well, I think McDonald's employees also deserve a union, just like teachers deserve a union and screen actors and everyone else.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really a matter of fighting for the working class. And obviously there's an issue in the country where people want to side with CEOs over the working class.
Yes. I'm not going to lie. I see the appeal in like quitting your job and getting a job somewhere else. If you put aside the reality of the job market right now, then the appeal of just like getting a job somewhere else that pays you better and treats you better. Like, yes, I see the appeal in that. You can only run away from your problems for so long before they come back to bite you. I care about this fight, and I've stuck around in this fight for as long as I have, because I know that at some point it's going to find me. Like when I was hired at Starbucks, a lot of my coworkers were around the same age as my youngest sibling. And I remembered how easy it was to like have that good nature be taken advantage of, and just how that made me feel. And I saw
that's a good point.
Yeah.
I keep seeing on social media people being like, it's a job for teenagers, go do something else. I mean, right off the bat, it's not primarily teenagers, but there are a lot of people that are teenagers even still working in high school.
Or like, however, even if you're like, you know, 20 somethings, if you're like on the early 20s end of things, like this is probably going to be your first job. Yeah. This is your first time working in like in a professional environment.
And to that point, I feel like it's really easy to take advantage of those people because they don't know what a good work environment might look like, or they might be more willing to put up with things that you learn later in life that you don't need to be putting up with. And also, maybe you're not quite as good at standing up for yourself. Sure, there's some young people and some older people that aren't good at it adversely, but I think it is a skill that's developed, at least for me personally. I was really okay with people kind of walking all over me when I first started at Starbucks, and now I absolutely would not.
Yeah, it's a skill to be able to stand up to the person who's in charge. It's a skill to be able to stand up to authority. It's a skill
the person that could fire you.
Yeah, exactly. If this is your first job, this is the job that's supposed to set the precedent for what at least what the rest of your professional career is going to be like. There are a number of skills you're probably going to develop for the first time working at Starbucks. And if they're not developed properly, it becomes a lot harder to unlearn just like those more damaging experiences, and kind of like
someone growing up in dysfunction and then getting older and realizing, oh, this was dysfunctional. That's not normal.
Yeah, you can absolutely go to a different workplace that might treat you better. But on a larger level, if you keep just like putting off like teaching people how to interact with their coworkers, how to interact with like the people above them, if you keep putting off that education, you keep putting off that skill development, it is going to be a lot harder to kind of undo the damage that kind of comes out as a result of this.
And I think we should think of that in terms of all jobs, like, right? It doesn't just have to be Starbucks, baristas, or even fast food work. Any entry-level job, or any job for that matter. Obviously, a lot of trade jobs or maybe more advanced jobs might have unions, but a lot don't. So if we ended up in our respective career fields of filmmaking, then there are unions set up. But that's not the case for a lot of careers, a lot of industries. And I think that's what's important, is that we need protections for all of the working class. It's not just about Starbucks employees. But I do like your point about sort of creating a better work environment, better standards, so that way then those people, if they do choose to move on from Starbucks, are entering into a workplace with a better mindset, with a better understanding and standards for what you do get as an employee and what is considered normal for benefits, be it part-time or full-time. Now, I want to just wrap up then with any closing thoughts. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to?
I think, the closing thought I guess I would have is like the entire idea of a union sprung up because people from across time looked at the world around them, looked at the society that's been kind of built, and they saw that there was something that was lacking. And the impulse that spurred the creation of labor unions is the same impulse that I think it's this very human impulse of just like, we only have each other to rely on. And they were stronger together because they were all vulnerable in much of the same ways together.
Having that community.
Yeah. You might not think that unions are necessarily important. You might not necessarily be convinced that, a union is going to be necessary.
But it creates a sense of community, at least.
Yes.
That wasn't something I was really thinking about.
Yeah.
That is true.
No, it creates that sense of community. And also, like, even if you don't necessarily care about unions, the conditions that create unions are going to find you one of these days. Maybe you don't have to deal with it today, but someday you will have to deal with that. And the people who are currently fighting to kill unions wherever they are starting to form are the very same people who are also going to decide to make your life worse just because it boosts the value of their stock a little bit.
Well, hope you guys enjoyed that interview. This show is written and produced by me, Era Zaffer. If you have not already, please consider supporting this podcast series on Patreon. For the price of a coffee a month, you can support this and future projects in the series while getting access to members' episodes, transcripts of the show, and a chance to win merch. Speaking of merch, don't forget to pick up a new shirt, hoodie, or mug from our merch site to support your favorite podcast on coffee history. Make sure to join our community on social media at the Complete History Podcast Series. If you would like to contact us, you can message us through social media or at our email, completehistorypod@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on, and make sure to share it with your friends and family. See you guys next time for more coffee history.